The German officer stood motionless in the recreation hall of Camp Concordia, Kansas, staring at the cake on the table before him. It was December 18th, 1944. Major Hans Werner, formerly of the Afrika Korps, had turned 32 years old that morning. The cake was real, white frosting, carefully applied. Candles, 32 of them, arranged in neat rows. An American sergeant stood beside the table, waiting expectantly. Werner's hands trembled. Not from cold, the barracks were heated better than any building he had occupied in North Africa. Not from hunger, the Americans fed their prisoners more calories per day than Wehrmacht soldiers received on the front lines. His hands trembled because nothing in his training, nothing in his experience, nothing in the entire ideological framework that had shaped his understanding of warfare had prepared him for this moment. He had expected beatings. He had expected starvation rations, forced labor unto death, perhaps, summary execution. The Americans were commanded by Jews and Bolsheviks, or so the propaganda had insisted. They were a mongrel race of gangsters and primitives who knew nothing of military honor or the conventions of civilized warfare. That was what he had been told. That was what he had believed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The sergeant was still waiting. Other prisoners, German officers and enlisted men, stood around the recreation hall watching. Some had tears in their eyes. One Luftwaffe pilot turned away, shoulders shaking. The Americans had brought a cake for a prisoner's birthday. They had remembered. They had cared enough to bake a cake for an enemy officer who 3 months earlier had been trying to kill American soldiers. Werner could not process this. His entire understanding of what capture meant, what defeat meant, what Americans were, collapsed in the presence of 32 candles on a birthday cake. This was not supposed to happen. In the world Werner understood, the world he had been trained to accept as reality, this moment was impossible. Yet here he stood, and there sat the cake, and the American sergeant was smiling at him with what appeared to be genuine warmth. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. Werner had seen men weep when they surrendered, fearing what would come next. He had watched officers prepare for torture, for execution, steeling themselves for the brutality they knew awaited prisoners in enemy hands. Some had attempted suicide rather than face capture. Now those same men stood in a heated recreation hall, well-fed, clothed in clean uniforms, watching an American sergeant present a birthday cake to their commanding officer. Werner stepped forward and blew out the candles. The room erupted in applause, Americans and Germans together. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Later, that night, he would write in his diary that this was the moment he understood Germany had lost more than the war. Germany had lost its understanding of what civilization meant. To understand why a birthday cake could shatter a German officer's worldview, one must understand the military culture that shaped him. The Wehrmacht was not merely an armed force. It was the product of Prussian military tradition stretching back centuries, merged with Nazi ideology, and hardened by 5 years of total war. Discipline was absolute. Punishment was severe. Compassion was weakness. German military training began with the principle that the individual existed only to serve the state. Officers were trained at academies where physical punishment was routine, where humiliation was a teaching tool, where any sign of softness was eliminated through systematic brutality. The Kriegsschule at Potsdam, where many Wehrmacht officers received their education, operated on principles that would have been familiar to Frederick the Great. Cadets who failed physical tests were beaten. Those who showed insufficient aggression in training exercises were publicly shamed. The entire system was designed to produce men who could order thousands to their deaths without hesitation and accept their own deaths with equal indifference. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was considered necessary preparation for modern warfare. German military theorists had studied the Great War and concluded that victory required absolute obedience, unwavering discipline, and the suppression of natural human reluctance to kill. Officers were taught that empathy was a tactical weakness, that treating subordinates with kindness undermined command authority, that the proper relationship between ranks was based on fear and respect, never affection. The Nazi Party had reinforced these traditions with its own ideological framework. Party indoctrination taught that humanity was divided into superior and inferior races, that Jews and Slavs and other Untermensch were not fully human, that normal moral considerations did not apply in relations with racial enemies. This ideology permeated the Wehrmacht despite its claims to political neutrality. By 1944, officers like Werner had spent years in an environment where shooting prisoners was administratively convenient, where starving occupied populations was military policy, where entire villages could be burned in reprisal without requiring special authorization. The treatment of prisoners under German control reflected this culture. Soviet prisoners of war died by the millions from deliberate starvation, exposure, and outright execution. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany, roughly 3.3 million died in captivity. That was a death rate of nearly 60%. Western Allied prisoners fared better due to Geneva Convention protections and fear of reprisals, but even they experienced harsh conditions, inadequate food, and frequent brutality. The system was designed around utility, not humanity. Prisoners who could work received minimal sustenance. Those who could not work received nothing. German soldiers preparing for combat against American forces received extensive indoctrination about their enemy. The propaganda was specific, detailed, and designed to prepare Wehrmacht personnel for the brutality they expected to encounter. The messages came through multiple channels: official training materials, Goebbels' propaganda ministry broadcasts, educational films, and briefings from superior officers who claimed intelligence from the front. American soldiers, the propaganda insisted, were not proper military men. They were a disorganized mob of criminals and racial inferiors commanded by Jewish financiers who cared nothing for military honor. The propaganda ministry distributed pamphlets showing photographs allegedly of American atrocities: mutilated German prisoners, bombed hospitals, murdered civilians. Many of these images were fabricated or showed German crimes falsely attributed to Americans, but soldiers had no way to verify their authenticity. Frontline troops received regular intelligence briefings warning them that capture by Americans meant torture and death. The propaganda focused particularly on racial themes. Americans, German soldiers were told, were commanded by Jews seeking revenge against the German people. The Roosevelt administration was described as a puppet of international Jewry. American combat units, the briefings claimed, included significant numbers of blacks and other racials who could not be expected to observe civilized rules of warfare. Troops were shown training films depicting American soldiers as undisciplined gangsters who shot prisoners for sport, who looted and raped their way across Europe, who recognized no military conventions. Joseph Goebbels' ministry produced specific materials for troops facing the Western Allies. One widely distributed pamphlet titled "What Awaits You in Enemy Hands" described in graphic detail the torture methods allegedly used by American interrogators. It claimed that American military police were recruited primarily from criminal populations, that camp guards were deliberately chosen for their sadistic tendencies, that Jewish officers were given special authorization to execute German prisoners. The document cited fabricated statistics showing that a German soldier's chance of survival in American captivity was minimal. Wehrmacht officers received additional indoctrination, emphasizing that surrender was both militarily impermissible and personally suicidal. Training materials compared American treatment of prisoners unfavorably to Soviet treatment, suggesting that at least the Bolsheviks shot captured officers quickly, while the Americans preferred prolonged torture. Officers were told that the Americans reserved special brutality for German leadership, that captured officers would be handed over to Jewish interrogators who would extract information through any means necessary before arranging convenient accidents. The propaganda was not entirely without foundation. It built on real American policies that could be portrayed as threatening. The unconditional surrender doctrine announced at Casablanca in 1943 was presented as proof that Americans intended the complete destruction of Germany. Strategic bombing campaigns that killed German civilians were cited as evidence of American barbarism. The propaganda ministry carefully documented every instance where American forces had committed genuine atrocities, rare as they were, and presented them as standard operating procedure rather than exceptional crimes subject to military justice. Major Hans Werner surrendered to elements of the 2nd Armoured Division on September 23, 1944, near the German border town of Aachen. His unit, a composite formation of Afrika Korps veterans and hastily trained replacements, had been cut off during the American advance following the breakout from Normandy. Werner had fought in North Africa since 1941. He had survived El Alamein, the retreat across Libya, and the final collapse in Tunisia. He had been repatriated to Germany in a prisoner exchange due to wounds, then reassigned to the Western Front when his injuries healed. By September 1944, he knew Germany was losing. What he did not know was what defeat would mean for him personally. The moment of surrender was unremarkable. American infantry, supported by a Sherman tank, had surrounded the farmhouse where Werner and 17 of his men had taken shelter. An American lieutenant approached under a white flag and called for them to come out with their hands visible. Werner ordered his men to comply. They filed out, hands raised, expecting to be searched and possibly shot. Instead, they were searched, relieved of weapons and valuables, given water from American canteens, and directed to sit in the farmyard while a sergeant recorded their names and ranks. The whole process took perhaps 20 minutes. No one was struck, no one was threatened. The American lieutenant spoke passable German and asked Werner if any of his men required medical attention. One soldier had a shrapnel wound in his leg that had become infected. An American medic examined it, applied sulfur powder, and bandaged it properly. The German soldier stared at the medic throughout the treatment, unable to comprehend why an enemy would waste medical supplies on a prisoner. Werner and his men were transported by truck to a temporary holding facility near Liège, Belgium. The journey took 3 hours. They sat in the back of American trucks, guarded by 2 soldiers with rifles who made no threatening gestures and offered cigarettes when the convoy stopped. At the holding facility, they were processed through a Tensche reception center, where American clerks speaking German took down detailed information about each prisoner: name, rank, unit, date of birth, next of kin. The clerks were polite, almost bored. This was routine administrative work for them. For Werner, it was surreal. He had expected interrogation under torture. He received a clipboard and a form to fill out. The holding facility consisted of tents surrounded by barbed wire. Latrines had been dug at one end of the compound. A mess tent occupied the center. Guards walked the perimeter but did not enter the prisoner areas except during scheduled counts. The first meal Werner received as a prisoner consisted of beef stew, white bread, canned fruit, and coffee. The portion was larger than what he had eaten as a Wehrmacht officer in the previous 6 months. He assumed this was a special meal designed to make prisoners compliant before interrogation began. He ate carefully, suspecting poison or drugs. Nothing happened. The next meal, breakfast, consisted of oatmeal, powdered eggs, bacon, and bread with butter. The meal after that was similar. Werner began to understand that this was simply how the Americans fed their prisoners, not as a psychological tactic, but as standard procedure. The interrogations, when they came, were nothing like what Werner had been prepared for. He was called to a tent where an American intelligence officer, a captain, sat behind a folding table with a notepad. The captain spoke fluent German with a Viennese accent. He was, Werner later learned, a Jewish refugee who had fled Austria in 1938. The irony was not lost on Werner. Here was the Jewish interrogator he had been warned about, the monster who would torture information from captured German officers. The captain asked about Werner's unit organization, recent movements, and command structure. Werner provided his name, rank, and serial number, as required by the Geneva Convention. The captain nodded, made some notes, and asked if Werner would like to provide any additional information voluntarily. Werner declined. The captain thanked him for his time and had a guard escort him back to the compound. The entire interrogation lasted 15 minutes. No threats were made, no violence occurred. Werner was more disturbed by the interrogation's mundane professionalism than he would have been by torture. Torture, he understood. Courtesy from a Jewish officer whose people Germany was attempting to exterminate, that he could not process. In late October 1944, Werner and approximately 400 other German prisoners were transported from Belgium to the port of Le Havre, France. They were loaded onto a Liberty ship, the SS William Patterson, for transport to the United States. The voyage across the Atlantic took 12 days. Prisoners were housed in converted cargo holds with bunks installed in tiers. The conditions were crowded but not deliberately harsh. Guards maintained order but did not abuse prisoners. The food was the same rations American troops received, prepared in the same galleys. Werner had served in the Kriegsmarine briefly before transferring to the army. He knew what conditions were like on German transport vessels. Prisoners being moved by German ships travelled in unheated holds with minimal food and no sanitation facilities. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The Liberty ship docked at Norfolk, Virginia, on November 9, 1944. Prisoners were transferred to trains for transport inland. Werner's group was designated for Camp Concordia in Kansas, one of dozens of prisoner-of-war camps the United States had constructed across the country to house the growing population of German and Italian prisoners. The train journey took 4 days, traveling west through Virginia, across Kentucky and Missouri, into Kansas. Prisoners traveled in regular passenger cars with windows that allowed them to see the American countryside. What they saw challenged every assumption they had made about their enemy. The landscape rolled past, mile after mile of farmland untouched by war. Towns with intact buildings, factories with smoke rising from chimneys, roads crowded with civilian automobiles. American guards told them that gasoline was rationed in the United States, that civilians had to limit their driving. Werner looked at the steady stream of traffic and tried to imagine what unlimited gasoline consumption would look like. The industrial capacity on display was staggering. Factories visible from the train were larger than any Werner had seen in Germany. Rail yards stretched for miles, filled with locomotives and freight cars in numbers that suggested unlimited manufacturing capacity. The prisoners passed through cities where electric lights blazed through the night, where store windows displayed consumer goods, where civilians walked streets without fear of bombing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. One evening, the train stopped in a Kansas town to take on water. Local civilians gathered at the platform to watch the prisoners. Werner expected hostility, perhaps violence. Instead, women from a church group approached with baskets of sandwiches and apples. American guards allowed them to distribute food to the prisoners. An elderly woman handed Werner a sandwich and an apple, smiled, and said something in English he did not understand. The guard translated, "She hoped he would be treated well and returned home safely to his family when the war ended." Werner held the sandwich and stared at the woman. She had sons in the military, the guard explained, and she prayed someone would show them kindness if they were ever captured. Werner ate the sandwich mechanically. His entire understanding of Americans as barbaric gangsters was crumbling. Part 6. The Climax of Reality. Camp Concordia Camp. Concordia was located outside the small town of Concordia, Kansas. Population approximately 5,000. The camp had been constructed in 1943 to house Italian prisoners, then repurposed for Germans as the number of Italian prisoners declined and German prisoners increased following the Normandy invasion. At its peak, Concordia held over 4,000 German prisoners. The camp consisted of barracks arranged in orderly rows, surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. From the outside, it looked like what Werner expected a prison camp to be. Inside, it was something else entirely. Each barracks housed 50 men in bunks with mattresses and blankets. The buildings were heated in winter and had electric lighting. Latrines and shower facilities were maintained with hot and cold running water. A camp hospital staffed by American military doctors and German prisoner medical personnel provided care for sick and injured prisoners. The food served in the mess halls exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. Breakfast typically included oatmeal or eggs, bacon or sausage, bread, butter, jam, and coffee. Lunch and dinner featured meat, vegetables, bread, and occasionally dessert. The daily caloric intake for prisoners at Camp Concordia averaged approximately 3,000 calories, more than German civilians were receiving in Germany by late 1944, more than Wehrmacht soldiers were receiving on the front lines. Prisoners were assigned work details, agricultural labor primarily, helping local farmers harvest wheat and other crops. Work was mandatory under Geneva Convention provisions, but the conditions were nothing like forced labor in German camps. Prisoners received small wages for their work, credit posted to camp accounts that could be used to purchase items from the camp canteen. The canteen sold cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other goods. Prisoners could also purchase beer, low alcohol 3.2% beer that American soldiers called near beer, but beer nonetheless. Werner watched men buy beer with their wages and drink it in the recreation hall while listening to German language programs on the camp radio. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The camp had recreational facilities that seemed impossible in a prisoner of war camp. A library stocked with German language books, many donated by American citizens of German descent. Sports fields, where prisoners played soccer. A theatre where prisoners staged performances using costumes and props they made themselves from materials provided by camp administration. The Americans allowed prisoners to organize their own cultural activities, to maintain military structure within the camp, to elect representatives who communicated prisoner concerns to American camp commandant. It was not freedom, but it bore no resemblance to the camps Werner had seen or heard about on the Eastern Front, where Soviet prisoners died by thousands from deliberate starvation and exposure. The American guards were professional but not cruel. They maintained discipline, enforced camp rules, and prevented escapes, but they did not beat prisoners or subject them to arbitrary punishment. Guards spoke to prisoners as human beings, sometimes shared cigarettes, occasionally discussed news from the war front. Some guards were German Americans who spoke German fluently and explained American customs and attitudes to confused prisoners. One guard, whose grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria, told Werner that America had no interest in destroying Germany or exterminating Germans. America wanted to defeat Nazism, occupy Germany until a stable democratic government could be established, then withdraw and allow Germans to rebuild their country. Werner had been taught that America intended to enslave Germany, to reduce it to an agricultural province, to eliminate German culture. The guard's casual description of American war aims contradicted everything Werner believed. The birthday cake incident occurred on December 18, 1944, approximately 6 weeks after Werner arrived at Camp Concordia. Camp records show that the recreation officer, Lieutenant Robert Henderson, maintained a list of prisoner birthdays and worked with the camp kitchen to prepare small celebrations when resources allowed. This was not official policy mandated by the War Department. It was Henderson's personal initiative, his belief that maintaining prisoner morale through small acts of humanity served American interests by preventing desperation and escape attempts. Henderson was a school teacher from Iowa in civilian life. He had studied German literature at university. He believed that Germans were not inherently evil, that Nazism was a political disease that had infected a cultured nation, and that treating prisoners humanely might help cure that disease. The cake itself was a simple yellow cake with white frosting, baked in the camp kitchen, using standard American military rations. Sugar, flour, eggs, butter, vanilla extract. The ingredients represented more abundance than Werner had seen in years. Germany's food situation had deteriorated catastrophically by late 1944. Civilians in German cities were surviving on rations of approximately 1,000 calories per day, supplemented by black market purchases for those with money or connections. Soldiers on the front received better rations, but still experienced chronic shortages of fats, proteins, and fresh foods. The German military had not issued butter to frontline troops in months. Yet here was an American military kitchen using butter to frost a birthday cake for an enemy prisoner. Lieutenant Henderson had invited Werner to the recreation hall under the pretense of discussing work detail assignments. When Werner entered and saw the cake on the table with 32 candles burning, he stopped walking. Other prisoners in the hall, men from Werner's barracks who had been let in on the surprise, stood silently watching. American guards lined the walls, also watching. Henderson spoke in German, wishing Werner happy birthday on behalf of the camp staff and expressing hope that next year Werner would celebrate his birthday at home with his family. Werner stood frozen. His training, his ideology, his entire framework for understanding the world could not accommodate this moment. He had been taught that Americans were motivated by racial hatred of Germans, that they sought Germany's destruction, that they treated prisoners with deliberate cruelty. Every element of that worldview was contradicted by 32 candles on a birthday cake. If the Americans hated Germans, why celebrate a German officer's birthday? If they sought Germany's destruction, why express hope for his safe return home? If they were cruel, why waste resources on such a gesture? Werner's hands began shaking. He tried to speak, but found he could not form words. Tears ran down his face, tears he could not control or explain. Other prisoners began crying as well. Luftwaffe Lieutenant Karl Brenner, who had shot down 7 American aircraft before being captured, turned away from the scene with his shoulders shaking. Panzer Commander Hauptmann Friedrich Klein sat down heavily on a bench and put his face in his hands. The Americans were confused by this reaction. They had expected pleasure, gratitude perhaps, maybe awkward appreciation. They had not expected grown men, veteran combat officers, to break down weeping at the sight of a birthday cake. Henderson approached Werner and gently guided him to the table. Werner sat. Henderson placed a knife in his hand. Werner cut the cake with mechanical precision, his officer's training allowing him to function even while his mind struggled to process what was happening. The cake was distributed. Americans and Germans ate together. Werner later wrote in his diary that the cake tasted like nothing he could describe, not because of its flavor, but because eating it required him to accept that everything he had believed about his enemies was a lie. The birthday cake incident became a defining moment for many prisoners at Camp Concordia, but not all prisoners experienced the same transformation. The German prisoner population was not ideologically uniform. Some were committed Nazis who had joined the party before it came to power and believed fully in its racial ideology. Others were career military men who served Germany without necessarily endorsing Nazi politics. Still, others were conscripts who had been drafted into service and fought because refusal meant death. The experience of humane treatment affected each group differently. For Werner and men like him, professional soldiers who had accepted Nazi ideology without deep personal commitment, the cognitive dissonance was profound but ultimately surmountable. Werner began questioning everything he had been taught. If the propaganda about American treatment of prisoners was false, what else was false? If Americans treated enemies with humanity, did that mean the racial theories he had accepted were wrong? If a Jewish interrogator could conduct himself with professional courtesy, did that invalidate the entire framework of Jewish conspiracy that underlay Nazi ideology? Werner spent weeks in mental turmoil, his old beliefs collapsing but no new framework yet in place to replace them. He talked with other prisoners who were experiencing similar crises. They discussed whether Germany deserved to win the war, whether their sacrifices had been in service of evil, whether they bore personal responsibility for the crimes they now suspected their government had committed. But a significant minority of prisoners reacted differently. Hardcore Nazis among the prisoner population saw American humanity not as evidence that their ideology was wrong, but as evidence that Americans were weak. They interpreted kindness as proof that Americans lacked the will to do what was necessary for victory. They organized resistance within the camps, intimidating prisoners who showed signs of abandoning Nazi beliefs, maintaining party discipline through threats and occasional violence. At Camp Concordia, as at many other American POW camps, a shadow hierarchy existed alongside the official camp structure. Nazi loyalists controlled certain barracks, enforced ideological conformity, and punished collaboration with American authorities. American camp administrators were aware of this problem, but struggled to address it effectively. The Geneva Convention prohibited interfering with prisoner self-organization beyond what was necessary for camp security. Removing hardcore Nazis from the general population and isolating them in separate facilities was possible, but logistically difficult given the number of prisoners involved. Some camps attempted re-education programs, showing prisoners newsreels of concentration camp, liberations, providing literature explaining democratic governance, offering classes in American history and civics. These programs had mixed results. Some prisoners were genuinely moved by evidence of Nazi crimes and began questioning their beliefs. Others dismissed the evidence as Allied propaganda, no more credible than the Nazi propaganda they now knew had lied to them about American prisoner treatment. Werner avoided the hardcore Nazi prisoners. He focused on his work details, helped in the camp library, and spent his evenings reading books he had been forbidden to read in Germany. He discovered American literature, Mark Twain and John Steinbeck, and found that Americans wrote with humanity and humor about subjects German literature treated with heavy philosophical seriousness. He talked with guards about American life, learning that America was not the plutocratic nightmare Nazi propaganda had described, but a complex society with genuine social problems alongside genuine freedoms. The more Werner learned, the more certain he became that Germany had been profoundly wrong, not just tactically in fighting a war it could not win, but morally in embracing an ideology that reduced humans to racial categories and justified atrocity in service of national greatness. By spring of 1945, as news reached the camps that Germany was collapsing under Allied offensives from east and west, Werner had largely completed his ideological transformation. He no longer considered himself a Nazi. He was not certain what he was instead, but he knew what he was not. When news came in May that Germany had surrendered unconditionally, Werner felt relief rather than grief. The war was over. He had survived. Perhaps there was a future beyond the ideology that had consumed his youth and young adulthood. Other prisoners reacted with despair, some with defiant declarations that Germany would rise again, but Werner felt only exhaustion and a tentative hope that something better might be possible. Werner remained at Camp Concordia until early 1946. The process of repatriating German prisoners began slowly after the war ended, complicated by destroyed infrastructure in Europe, political disputes about which occupation zone prisoners would return to, and American use of prisoner labor to address agricultural labor shortages in the United States. Werner worked on Kansas farms through the harvest season of 1945, earning wages that were deposited to his camp account. When he finally boarded a ship for Germany in February 1946, he carried with him several $100s in American currency, money he had earned during captivity. He also carried letters from American families he had met, farmers who had employed him on work details and invited him to correspond after returning home. Most significantly, he carried a fundamentally altered understanding of the world. Werner returned to a Germany that no longer existed, in any form he recognized. His home city of Dresden had been destroyed by firebombing. His family had fled to relatives in Bavaria. The country was divided into occupation zones, its industry dismantled, its population struggling to survive on minimal rations. The gap between the abundance Werner had witnessed in America and the devastation he found in Germany was almost incomprehensible. He had eaten better as a prisoner in Kansas than his family was eating in occupied Germany. This fact alone contained a lesson about the war's outcome that no amount of propaganda could obscure. Germany had challenged a nation with such surplus productive capacity that it could feed enemy prisoners better than Germany could feed its own citizens. Werner eventually settled in West Germany, married, worked as a teacher, and raised a family. He rarely spoke about his war service, but he spoke often about his time as a prisoner in America. In interviews conducted in the 1970s and 80s, when historians began systematically documenting the experiences of German POWs in American camps, Werner described the birthday cake incident as the moment his worldview shattered. He said that he had been prepared to die for beliefs he held in 1944, but those beliefs could not survive contact with the reality of how Americans actually behaved. The propaganda had told him that Americans were monsters. The birthday cake proved they were human. Once he accepted that Americans were human, he had to confront the possibility that Germans were the monsters in this story. Tens of thousands of German prisoners passed through American camps during and after World War II. Approximately 375,000 German prisoners were held in the United States at the war's peak. The death rate among German prisoners in American custody was less than 1%, compared to nearly 60% for Soviet prisoners in German custody. This statistical disparity reflected fundamental differences in how the two systems valued human life. Germany treated prisoners as expendable resources to be worked to death or simply eliminated. America treated prisoners as humans, entitled to basic protections under international law. This difference was not merely a matter of available resources, though America's abundance certainly made humane treatment easier. It was a difference in foundational values. The treatment of German prisoners in American camps served multiple purposes beyond satisfying Geneva Convention obligations. It demonstrated to German soldiers that surrender was preferable to fighting to the death, encouraging surrenders that saved both American and German lives. It provided evidence that Allied war aims were limited to defeating Nazism, not destroying Germany, which supported post-war reconstruction efforts by showing Germans that cooperation with occupation authorities would not lead to their extermination. It maintained American moral credibility in a war against an ideology defined by its embrace of atrocity. Perhaps most importantly, it preserved the humanity of American soldiers and camp administrators who might otherwise have been brutalized by years of combat against a vicious enemy. The small gesture of a birthday cake for a prisoner represented something larger than kindness to an individual. It represented a choice about what kind of nation America would be even in the midst of total war. The Americans who baked that cake, who organized that small celebration, were not naive about Nazi crimes or confused about who bore responsibility for the war. They were making a deliberate choice to treat their enemies as human beings, despite everything those enemies had done and represented. That choice reflected confidence that American values were worth preserving even in combat against an enemy who rejected all values except power. For Werner and prisoners like him, that birthday cake accomplished what no amount of propaganda or re-education programming could achieve. It forced them to confront the possibility that everything they had been taught was wrong, that their enemies were more civilized than they had been, that their own nation had descended into barbarism while claiming to defend civilization. That realization was devastating. It required accepting personal responsibility for having served evil, for having believed lies, for having participated in a system that committed atrocities. But it also opened the possibility of redemption, of building something better from the ruins of everything that had been destroyed. The story of German prisoners weeping at birthday cakes is not a story about American virtue or German wickedness, though elements of both are present. It is a story about what happens when propaganda meets reality, when carefully constructed belief systems collide with undeniable evidence, when humans are forced to recognize the humanity of those they have been taught to hate. It is a story about the power of simple gestures to communicate profound truths. And it is a story about the cost of truth, the psychological price paid by those who discover that everything they believed, everything they fought for, everything they were willing to die for, was based on lies. Werner died in 1998 at age 86. His obituary in a German newspaper mentioned his military service briefly, then focused on his career as a teacher and his work promoting German-American friendship through cultural exchange programs. He had spent the second half of his life trying to ensure that future generations would not repeat the mistakes his generation had made. In interviews late in life, he often returned to that December day in Kansas when Americans gave him a birthday cake. He said it was the day he stopped being a Nazi and started trying to become human again. The journey from that moment to genuine humanity took years, but it began with 32 candles, on a cake baked by former enemies who had decided that even in war, some gestures of basic human decency were worth preserving. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.